welcome to this second night of our colloquium on great books and democracy presented by the MPC Great Books program. I'm David Clemens, the program founder and coordinator. This colloquium was made possible by a generous grant from the APGAR Foundation and is co-sponsored by the Monterey County Weekly. Thanks also again go to Michelle Brock, Rosa Arroyo, George Reed, and Jeanette Haxton. Please take a moment to power off your cell phones or your iPads. I saw one in the audience. And I would remind you that the views expressed here, including mine, are those of the speaker. MPC, as always, is committed to institutional neutrality and to being the host of ideas, not their sponsor. Last week I suggested that the question of a relationship between great books and democracy involves three provocative questions. Do books and reading differ in a significant way from other forms of expression? I'll just proceed. Three provocative questions. Do books and reading differ in a significant way from other forms of expression? Are some books greater than other books? And does the reading of these greater books, literature, in some way nurture both the individual and democracy itself? We then heard the distinguished poet Robert Pinsky explain his conviction that the somatic or bodily experience of literature has a democratizing influence. The medium of a poem, Pinsky says, is the body of the one who speaks it. In this regard, while he was here, Robert mentioned a favorite teacher of his at Rutgers, Francis Ferguson. In The Voice of Letters, he describes Ferguson this way. Sometimes he lectured, more often in his world drama class. Here is what he did. He would gently indicate to three students, disregarding matters of gender or actorly skill, you please read Gertrude's lines, you read Hamlet's, you read Polonius's lines. Or it might be Jocasta, Oedipus, and the Messenger, or Anya, Varya, and Trefimov. So when Ferguson had us listen to the contending personae of Chekhov or Sophocles in our own voices, the actual poema, the doing, as requisite preliminary to the inner pathema of feeling that enables the mathema, knowing or understanding, any provincial or imperfect quality in the performance was functional because it dramatized and clarified and indeed embodied the process by showing that the ultimate theater is internal. Pinsky affirms that, quote, the Athenian tragic theater confirmed or encouraged the notion of an inward place of ritual expectation where one's own individual voice participated in the imitation of great and important actions. The availability of great art in the space of one's individual imagination became part of a vision simultaneously democratic and superior. Robert closed by reciting Sailing to Byzantium, particularly noting Yeats's line, nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. That study of monuments recalls the original core curriculum of classic texts at Columbia. The Literature, Humanities, and Contemporary Civilization core arose 90 years ago from a fear that over-specialization in college would produce less effective citizens not equipped to make wise decisions in public or private matters, having no models, no philosophy, no foundation from the past. As James Burke likes to say, if you don't know how you got somewhere, you don't know where you are. Just a few days ago, tonight's speaker wrote about visiting Fresno State's million-volume library, only to discover that almost none of the patrons were reading. He wrote, then a thought came. This is most definitely not quite a library for most. Yes, its basement is a sort of forgotten archive of a vanquished civilization of readers. but its top floors are self-glorious monuments to current sociology. There is no need to burn libraries, no need to burn books when no one wants to read them. But if books do have a democratizing effect, I must renew the same troubling question that I asked last week. Might it be that the fate of liberal arts is tied to the fate of liberal democracy itself? That the fate of literature is entwined with the fate of the West? 2 weeks ago at Pinsky's alma mater, I'm almost done, I promise. 2 weeks ago at Pinsky's alma mater, I heard presentations by all the leaders of Columbia University's current core curriculum, which has now expanded from literature, humanities, and contemporary civilization to add music humanities, art humanities, global humanities, and frontiers of science, because today's Ivy League freshmen arrive devoid of knowledge in all those areas. Now I heard professors teach from scraps and excerpts, not books. And I heard the head of today's contemporary civilization core, a historian, sarcastically say, Western civilization, whatever that is. He went on to characterize the West's achievements in scientific progress, medicine, the end of slavery, the advances of civil rights and women's rights. These he described as an historical accident. I believe that tonight's speaker may hold a different view, a less dismissive view of the West. A classicist and military historian, Dr. Victor David Hanson has emerged as a lucid and powerful diagnostician of the ills of our age. Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College, has said of him, Victor Hanson brings to his writing a mixture of learning and reflection that is rare in any age, especially the ignorant one in which we live. A prolific writer of 17 books and nearly 200 articles for publications from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal, Dr. Hanson reanimates the past in order to illuminate the present. His most recent book of collected essays, The Father of Us All, War and History, Ancient and Modern, was just released this week. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Victor David Hanson.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I've spent most of my life as a classicist, and it's a very strange profession. One time I was asked to speak on immigration, of all things, to a House caucus committee. And as I was beginning, I was introduced as a classicist. And a young aide to Nancy Pelosi got up and said, "See, he's a racist because he believes in class oppression." And I said, "I don't believe in class oppression." He said, "Well, you're a classicist, you must." And I tried to explain that classicus is a Latin word meaning the study of classic things, of a higher meaning they're older or more renowned. We have all these misimpressions of classicists. When I came home, I was 25 and I got a PhD at Stanford in classics. It was a very old-fashioned philological department at that time where it was mostly Greek and Latin manuscripts and text composition. I had a very witty but cynical older brother, and came home and there were no jobs, so I started farming. And he said, "So what did you learn?" I said, "I can write the San Francisco Chronicle, I can translate in Latin and Greek." And he said, "It reminds me of a quote from Samuel Johnson." He goes, "That's very impressive. It's like a dog who can walk on two legs, but nobody would want to know why one would want to do that." the ability. So it was a very strange discipline. It's almost ended as we know it. What I'd like to do tonight is talk about the great books in democracy, and then give a brief introduction to where democracy came from, and then give an overview of why people on the left did not like it in antiquity and in the present, and why people on the right don't like it in antiquity and the present, and then open it up for discussion. But when we say a classic or great book, remember, we don't really mean something that's just old. Classic was a term that was created in the 18th century by taking the Latin word classicus to mean something of a higher value than other literature. That's not politically correct today. Everything is supposedly equal, but not originally. And there's 53 million words in the Greek language that have survived. And believe me, we do not read Artemidorus' dream book, or Didymus's commentary on Demosthenes, or Aeneas Tacticus's, I do, but most sane people don't, his treatise on siegecraft. We read Sophocles' Antigone and Homer's Iliad. They are better works. Now, what do we mean by better? What are the criteria we use if it's not age? Well, it's transcendence. Reading Flaubert, or reading Hobbes, or reading Plato means that they address issues that are more important than Marvel Comics or Tom Clancy. By that I mean issues that speak to the human condition. Life, death, marriage, children, war, peace, these things. And they not only speak to them, they transcend time and space. They do it in such a way that they don't go away. And they bring up the other issue of what education is. Educare in Latin, to lead somebody from some place to some place else, to lead somebody from ignorance into the Enlightenment. I wish I could say that we have education in the classical sense, but obviously we don't, especially in this. I'm a teacher, so I have no qualms. I was a public teacher for saying that the California teachers are the highest paid in the nation, yet we score 47 and 48th in test of English and math. If we were to look at most of the CSU campuses where I taught, you will see a dash studies, leisure studies, environmental studies, ethnic studies, black studies, community studies, even drug studies. I was on the general education committee and there was a course called leisure studies. And the course that I had tried to reject was the theory of walking. And I said, this is not as valuable as another course. And that let off a hailstorm. I mean, hail almost. Everybody was furious that I had said that. But what do we mean by that? Well, classical education simply was the ability to make sense out of the nonsense of the present through an understanding of the past. So that if you were trying to be nice to somebody, the nicer you were, the meaner they got to you. Or you had a boyfriend and you were a young girl and the more you gave him presents, the meaner he treated you. Or if you looked at the administration and the more talented you were as a teacher, the more suspicious. You didn't think that just happened to you at this moment. That Sophocles had written about it in the Antigone. That Sophocles' Ajax had said, live nobly or nobly die, and had committed suicide over that. That Achilles said, basically, all of the bad people get the awards like Agamemnon, and all the courageous people like me get nothing. I don't want anything to do with this rotten system. In other words, you can learn all of that without having to experience it. That was what education is. And how was it delivered? Well, it was delivered by two basic principles that are lost in the CSU, the UC system today. One is you had to have a body of knowledge. You had to know what the Pythagorean theory was. You had to have some idea of what King Lear was. You had to have some notion of the tripartite system of the American Constitution. And then you had to have an inductive method. That means that you had to look at items, facts, and then through a process of induction come to a conclusion. You couldn't just have knowledge and be educated if you didn't have the inductive method. You couldn't just have the inductive method. You would just be a blank rhetorician or blowhard if you didn't have facts. And unfortunately, 2,500 years of Western civilization has told us there's only a few things that can impart that knowledge. Philosophy, biology, mathematics, languages. But unfortunately, it's not dash studies. Those are pretty much the contemporary world looking at it and saying, gee whiz, there's telephone poles or there's cheers on TV or some people are not nice to other people, but not going into any of these issues in depth. So that's why we have, I think, a problem today with education in general. It's not based on anything that has been proven to work in the last 2,500 years. Moving to democracy, have you ever asked yourself this, if we want to continue in this politically incorrect fashion? If I say a number of words, democracy, oligarchy, constitution, republic, ostracism, censure, any of these terms, they're not old Swedish terms. None of my ancestors knew what they were about. When these things were being bandied about in Greece, my ancestors were with cow horns in their head. Anything in the Swedish language was of no value. We don't know it today. Nobody was using a Mixotec language. These words do not exist in Arabic. They do not exist in Babylonian. What does that tell us? It tells us, whether you like it or not, something different was going on in Greece and Rome. It was not just different, it was very different than the alternative. And number two, these words are ubiquitous in that language. And so constitutional government was an integral part of the ancient world. And that's why it survives in the West today. But it doesn't survive elsewhere. If you're in Iraq, I went there on two tours during to the front, and one of the things that surprised me is when I don't understand Arabic, but I do understand the Arabic attempt to say democracy in long conversations that were translated. Why didn't they have an Arabic word for democracy? They had to say democracy. They used our word. Every other country uses that word, but it's not our word. It's a Greek word. And that emphasizes, again, the origins of these notions. Now, where do we know about democracy? Well, it comes from a written word, and there's only about 10 or 12 really places you have to look. There's Plato and Aristotle, Plato's Laws and Republic, Aristotle's Politics. There are philosophical, abstract speculations on governments they saw. Aristotle collected 158 constitutions of different typologies. We have one left, the Constitution of Athens. There are plays where people talk, Euripides' Supplements, or Aristophanes' Comedies, The Wasp, where they talk about democracy and kind of make fun of it or praise it. Scarcely praise it. One play praises it. There are speeches in the assembly where people call each other all sorts of names. If you read Aeschines' attack on Demosthenes, he says, by the fact that your mother conducted prostitution out of an outhouse has nothing to do, and I won't mention it, as he mentions it. So we get also very close to contemporary politics. We also have, in addition to that, we have Herodotus and Thucydides, historians who wrote about Athenian democracy. So we know a lot about ancient democracy. And I want, before we go into some of the strengths and weaknesses of it, let's just clarify our terms. I wish we used the term today. Have you ever noticed, let me just make a parenthetical. I think I'm out again, but I'm going to go ahead and scream, if that's okay. Have you ever noticed how many times people say, it's not a democracy, they just voted. Iraq's not a democracy. Or they'll say, yeah, they voted, but it's not a real democracy in the West Bank. Or we're not a real democracy. What do they mean by that? What they mean by that is what Aristotle tried to explain that nobody reads today, that there's a lot of typologies and that democracy has nothing to do with a plebiscite. Saddam Hussein had a plebiscite. I was on the academic senate at Cal State Fresno. I don't think it was a democracy. Every time I went in to vote, it was 98-1 on every issue. It was worse than Saddam Hussein's plebiscites. What Aristotle said was this. He used the word politeia, or constitutional government. Government by laws that are ratified by the people. And within those parameters, there was a broad inclusion of people called democracy, the demos, or the people, and there was a smaller group called the oligoi, the oligarchs, oligarchy, and everything in between. And what he was trying to suggest is, I'm going to give you the strength of having everybody participate and having a few participate. And Plato and Demosthenes, that's what they were discussing within those parameters. That's what we call constitutional consensual government. Europe, us, Australia, we all have different typologies of constitutional government. Now, where did it come from? This is the most fascinating question that I think as an ancient historian that you can comprehend. Somewhere around 750 BC, 1,500 city-states appeared out of a past that was Near Eastern. The Mycenaeans were autocratic. They were monolithic palatial cultures. They were not consensual. And suddenly in 750, you had constitutional government of everything except democracy, broad participation. And this went on for about 200 years. It was, I think, I could make the argument, and I did in a book called The Other Greeks, it was based on the protection of property-owning citizens. Until that time, nobody was given rights to own a particular piece of property, improve it, and pass it on to an heir. And the need to protect that and create a property-owning class is the origins, really, of Western civilization. In 507, 250 years after the presence of these constitutional states, something weird happened in Athens. I'm basing this on the study of the great books of Herodotus, who describes the revolution or the rebellion, and Thucydides, who talks about it at length. The Athenians decided to do something that no other city-state had done. They were going to extend the participation to those who did not have property. And that doubled the number of people. And then they almost immediately came up on a problem. And the problem was, and I think this will be very familiar to all of you, if everybody can vote and participate, and we want to broaden the power base and take power away from just the property owners and give it to the poor who do not own property, what happens if they don't vote? What happens if they're not as wealthy as the property owner? What happens if they didn't have a nice parent? What happens if they have one leg and they can't walk into the assembly? All of the tragedies and the unfairness that make us unequal by birth, Athenians tried to rectify. This type of democracy was not only like nobody had ever seen in the ancient world. We've only seen it in the West, maybe during the times of the French Revolution, or periods in American history that we see it during the Roosevelt period. Maybe some of you critics will say it's starting to happen with Obama. You see it in Europe at various times. It's an emphasis on equality of result rather than equality of opportunity. Now, what did the Athenians do then from 507 to the history of their democracies? Well, they tried to make people equal. How would you do that? You'd let everybody vote on any given day, no matter if they were registered, no matter if they were educated. You just said the first 7,000 guys that show up in Phoenix get to vote. And pretty soon in the 4th century, you can say the first 7,000 get to vote, and we're going to pay you to vote. Equivalent today of about $100. Well, people who need $100 will vote, and people who don't maybe won't walk into Athens. And you know what we're also going to do? We're going to pay you to go to the theater so that you'll have some culture. And then if we want a fleet, we're going to take them, the wealthy, and we're going to tax them. They get to put their name on the trireme, they get to put their little banner, but they're going to pay for the fleet. And then we're going to think, they're still too powerful. So we're going to introduce something called ostracism. It's sort of like saying to you guys, every year America gets to vote on your laptop. The guy who gets 1 million votes has to leave. I can think of a lot of people I'd like to ostracize. Donald Trump, maybe. Cindy Sheehan. Who knows? But they ostracized every powerful person in Athens at one time. You didn't have to show cause. And then, if that wasn't enough to ensure an equality result, they had what we call popular courts. You maybe have read Plato's Apology and seen what happened to poor old Socrates. A popular court said that somebody could walk up in Athens and tap you on the shoulder, said, "See you in court." They go to a popular court. There's anywhere from 200 to 1,000 jurors. There's no DA. There's no indictment. I speak, my opponent speaks. I try to suggest that every time I give a speech, I try to suggest that my opponent has engaged in passive homosexual intercourse, and he tries to suggest that I have done the same, in passing. Or he tries to say that I've looted the treasury, or I'm really illegitimate, before we get down to the issue in hand. And then people vote. 51%, and that's it. There is no constitutional law. Now, what do we learn from this? We learn that for the history of constitutional government, there is going to be a war in constitutional systems between liberty, the ability to be free from coercion, and equality. We think they're the same. Everybody in America is for equality, everybody's for liberty. No, there's two different words in the Greek language, eleutheria and isonomy, and they're antithetical. They're at war with each other. Everybody see that? And Athens decided to err on the side of equality. Sparta, Thebes, landed constitutional states said, no, we're going to err on the side of liberty. That issue has never been resolved in the West. If we go to Europe today, we look at the European EU document and constitution. You look at the French Revolution, fraternity, egalitarianism. That's there. It's not give me liberty or give me death. The American Revolution, the American Constitution erred on the side of liberty. If you err on the side of liberty, you accept some inequality. Life's tragic. If you err on the side of equality, you don't. You say life's therapeutic. We can change. We can make people equal, even if they're not. So that was a great argument. Now here's what's ironic about it. Athens, because it included so many people and was so dynamic because of its inclusivity, became the largest city-state in this system. Sparta got smaller and smaller. Thebes was a backwater. Corinth was impressive but never reached the levels of Athens. All the critics of Athens, and let me say here, I can't think of a single classical author that liked democracy. Not Plato, not Aristotle, not Thucydides, not Herodotus, not the old oligarch, not Xenophon. They all hated it. They all preferred landed constitutional government. And I can't think of one who didn't come to Athens to write. Think about that. It's like saying that I used to do this in the 90s when I'd have to go see book publishers. I'd say, I hate going to New York. God, I hate New York. I hate New York. I hate New York. And my father, who lived on the farm, said, well, why in the hell are you going then? And the point was everything was happening in New York. Well, everything was happening in Athens because it was radically democratic. Maritime sea power. But this is what is stunning. Athenian democracy is so well documented, and all the people who wrote about it were critical, and it perished in 338 with the onset of Alexander the Great. And we have some notable glimpses, maybe they were unfairly collated, but when Thucydides gives us a Melian dialogue about how Athenians come into the island of Melos and tell the people they're going to butcher them because they're weak and they're necessary to be subjects and they don't have freedom, that made a great impression. And when Thucydides records the Mytilenean debate, when they vote to kill all the male members of the polity on Lesbos who revolted, and when Plato gives us Crito, Euthyphro, and Apology, and shows us the execution of Socrates on trumped-up charges, people got scared of it. And for the history of Western thought, whether we go to Cicero's De Republica, or you look at Locke or Hobbes, democracy in the Athenian brand is a bad word until the French Enlightenment. And it's only thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, who believed that democracy was good. Other thinkers, Locke, Montesquieu, but especially our founding fathers, said, you know what? It was the start, and it didn't work. It was an evolutionary dead end, this equality of result. What we liked were an enlightened oligarchy, and we were an oligarchy at the beginning. Remember, our Constitution was limited to property owners, but especially a res publica, a tripart system where you had a judicial system that checked an executive system, that checked a legislative system, and vice versa, which is from Montesquieu, copied that idea from the Romans, who copied it from the Cretans, who copied it from the Spartans, and that's our present system today. So Athenian democracy, as powerful and dynamic as it is, has never been copied except in a few periods. It's always been a promise of something, of intellectuals who said that we can recapture that fervor, that Parthenon, that Acropolis, that Sophocles, that Aeschylus. But nobody's ever quite tried to do that, because to do that you will have to do what the Athenians did to Socrates, to the lesbians, and to the Melians. It requires a level of coercion if people want to have their liberty and not go along with this equality.
Oh, this one doesn't
Okay,
work.
this one works. So let me just recap. Democracy started in 507 BC. It ended in 338. Very short lifespan. It was a pocket within a larger continuum of constitutional government, 750, all the way down till Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 44 BC, where most of the ancient world thought they wanted to be constitutional, but have checks on popular sovereignty. They didn't trust the people to have absolute power. And that left a legacy in Western civilization of constitutional states. Venice, the Swiss, the French, but no one really wanted to be radically democratic. And when it was tried during the French Revolution or some periods in American history, people get very frightened of it. And part of the reason is they read the great books and look at what admittedly aristocratic authors said about Athens. Now, what were the two great criticisms, or I should say one great criticism, because it includes a lot of minor ones, and the one great praise of ancient democracy, and how is that true today? Well, believe it or not, the one great criticism was that Athens was not inclusive enough. Democracy doesn't include them. Let's take the modern version of that. Some of you are shaking your heads and you said, this guy's sitting up here, this white male guy, he doesn't understand they didn't let slaves and women participate. Well, there's 350,000 people in Attica, the area around Athens, and if you take away women and the 80,000 slaves and the 20,000 foreigners, you only get about a third of the population participating in the most liberal state in Greece. They would say to us, compared to what? Slaves are everywhere in the Mediterranean. You think a Babylonian or an Egyptian has a play like Aristophanes where the slaves are the heroes? Do you think that anybody up in Iceland has a play called Sophocles' Antigone? The Electra? The Hecuba? The Helen? The Lysistrata? Women are integral to Athenian society. So the ancient Athenian says, we're working on it. We're working on it. And we have plays and literature where we are critiquing in this process so well known to all of us of self-critique. So when we look back at the ancient world, the Athenians would say, hey, you guys, you have 2,500 years of being on someone else's shoulders. History is tragedy. It's not melodrama. You don't go back to the past and use your little present system and then pick winners and losers. Look at what we were trying to do. We were trying to include everybody, but we have to overcome certain facts. In the ancient world, to get 3 people to survive, a woman has to be pregnant 16, 17 times. I mean, a third of the pregnancies aren't going to come to term. A fourth of them are not going to result in a live birth, and probably another 20 or 30% of the deliveries the child isn't going to live past 3 years. So if a woman is pregnant or nursing most of her life, the average life expectancy was somewhere around 40, she's not going to have time to participate. And nobody has vacuum cleaners, electric plugs, cars, so somebody's going to have to be doing all the things that we take for granted. And remember another thing the Athenians would say in their defense. We didn't invent the idea that race had anything to do with slavery. That was a later idea of the 16th century. Aristotle said, I'm trying to prove there's a natural slave. He said, I'm trying to prove because other people didn't believe him. Slavery was an equal opportunity oppression. The reason it was not eliminated in the ancient world, it was bad luck. So Victor Hanson gets up one day, he's driving to Monterey tonight, and there's a little siege of Watsonville, and they happen to be driving through, and all the people from Salinas have taken over Watsonville. I just happen to be in the Watsonville city limits, and we're all enslaved. And that happened yearly in the ancient world. And I go to work for somebody in Watsonville, or Salinas, until I can buy my freedom. And if I say to somebody, well, wait a minute, I have a PhD. I'm the modern equivalent of Hippocrates or Galen or somebody, and the person who owns me paints houses. I'm tutoring his kids. And I say, this isn't fair. And the owner says to me, life's not fair. I never said slavery was based on inferiority. I said it was based on bad luck. So you're a slave and I'm free, and next time don't get caught in Watsonville. That was pretty much the rationale of ancient slavery. That is very insidious. It's hard to eliminate. When the Europeans discovered Africa and the New World, they said, wow, these people are not literate. These people are not up to European. Therefore, we've solved Aristotle's problems. We can make them slaves. And then suddenly in the American South or in South America, people said, well, wait a minute. You teach an African American how to read, and he can read as well as anybody. Therefore, he's not a natural slave. And then that started the entire abolition movement. It was easier to eliminate slavery once it was tied to a bankrupt theory like racial inferiority, because it was not tied to that. Plato himself was supposedly a slave for 2 years. Aesop was a slave. We have a number of slaves who are quite brilliant, but it makes it insidious. As far as women, I mentioned the biological constraints, but remember also the Greek male of the household voted, but he didn't vote for himself. He voted for the oikos, the household. So he came home, and often we have scenes from Menander or Aristophanes where his wife says, now you're going to go to the assembly and you're going to vote this way. If you don't do it, in the case of Lysistrata, you're not having sex. You're going to vote to end the Peloponnesian War, and if you don't end the vote against the war, you're never going to have sex with me. That's a play. So we get the idea that there was influence and that women dressed, there was no veils, they talked candidly in a way that was not true elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Athenian society was not a Mediterranean society. It was an anti-Mediterranean society. It was like no other society in Egypt or in Asia Minor. It was quite unique. That would be their defense of slavery and women, that they were working on it, they were evolving, they had already addressed it, etc. They would also... What about this other criticism from the left? There's an iron law of oligarchy, that even if you say people are going to vote, not everybody gets to vote because of poverty, their car breaks down. We see this in our own society. That yes, people are free to vote, but they don't participate, therefore we should have a DMV, motor voter, etc. The Athenians would say, well, nobody's ever done it better than us. Why are we subsidizing people to vote and you're not doing it now? So in their way of thinking, once you set up a democracy, as I said earlier, then they were going to pay, bribe, subsidize people to participate. They did it to such a degree that Aristotle in his Politics wrote something quite stunning at one point. He said, demos means people, krasi means rule of the people. It's not the rule of the people, it's the rule of the poor people, if you really think about it. And what he meant by that is that when you have democracies, poor people run things. Not just people, not just a majority, poor people through the legislative, judicial, executive efforts to take money from some and give it to others. The Athenians really did believe they could bring people up out of poverty by taking money from someone else. And they were quite successful, at least for a while. Now, that's their defense of democracy. What was the right-wing harangue against democracy? Or what is it today? Well, the main one, of course, is that we're not all equal. Sorry that we're not all of the same IQ. We're not all good-looking, or we're not all ugly, we're not all lame, we're not all able-bodied. So we start out with different abilities. So the democratic idea that if every one of you is going to get 10 acres and some olive trees, in about 30 years, half of you aren't going to have them. Because some of you aren't going to get up in the morning because you're lazy, you're no damn good. Others are going to be very unlucky. You're going to fall off the olive tree and break your leg, and that's it in the ancient world. Others are going to think, you know what, I'd rather make pots and lay around all day in this city, so I'm going to sell mine. So inequality will begin very quickly because some will buy others out, and that's what happens. So why not recognize it under an oligarchy? That people who have shown the initiative should be able to have more prestige. It's almost like saying, if you were a right-wing oligarch, and believe me, I think I can be fair to an anonymous author called the Old Oligarch that wrote 440 BC. I think I can be fair to him in how he would appraise Freddie and Fannie. He would say this, oh, you can make up your Freddie and Fannie all you want. You can lower your interest rates all you want. But believe me, Mr. Hanson, there are people by birth, our attitude, our culture, our habit, who are not up to owning property. They are renters, period. Now, you can say they're homeowners, and you can print a bunch of money, give them a lot of low interest, guarantee their loans, but they're going to collapse your system. That's what he said, basically that. In other words, the right-wing critique of democracy is that it's a lie. That when you want to radically make everybody equal when they are not, it requires two things: the loss of individual liberty and a degree of coercion that's not acceptable within a civilized society. And that's continually the critique. If you read Thucydides, he says, Athens was the most powerful city-state. After every setback, they could recuperate because they got everybody involved. That's what's good about a democracy. But he said they will continue to get themselves in jams because when they get into the assembly, every elegant speaker, every aristocratic wealthy person, every skilled person will cause envy and jealousy, and he will offend the mass, and they will shout him down eventually, and then they are fickle. That's a very good word, an English translation of a lot of Greek words, by meaning they will change from one idea to the other because they're not guided by senior sober statesmen and they don't follow a constitutional law. And by that he meant one day they decide to execute the rebellious leaders on the island of Lesbos. They get up there and a speaker named Cleon says, I think these people had it pretty good. They were a tributary state, but we gave them a lot of privileges. They revolted. I suggest we kill everybody over 16. Yes! Yes! They all vote, kill, kill, kill. So he says, let's send out the triremes with the death sentence. They all go home. They start, I was kind of in a bad mood today in the assembly. So Diodotus says, you know what? I heard a lot of guys mumbling, so let's have another assembly. And he gets up and says, hey, if we kill everybody, it's kind of a bad idea. I don't mind killing everybody, but there might have been some guys who spoke out against it. And if we kill everybody and all the other states know that if you speak out against it, you're going to die too, they're just going to go along and we're going to have a lot. So let's vote again. And so this time they voted and said, that was a bad idea. And then someone said, well, we sent the trireme out yesterday. It's only 180 miles to Lesbos. They said, let's get another trireme and pay people a bonus to row all night. So you have this wonderful description of Thucydides, and you can see why he put this in his history, because it's a primer on democracy, where all these poor lesbians, they're not gay, they're just people from Lesbos, they all have their throats out, and they're just about ready to be slit lining the harbor, when the second trireme comes in and says, wait! You all get to live except the ringleaders. And this is Thucydides' description of what can happen with what he called mob rule. And finally, the right-wing critiques were so vehement they didn't use the word democracy. They used ochlocracy, mob rule, rule of the ochlos, the crowd, the rabble. Let me finish then, and then we can have some questions. What am I suggesting? That the issues that we are involved in right this moment, we're going to have a conservative Tea Party rally this week. We're going to have a left-wing immigration rally on May Day. We had a conservative government with Bush, or so-called conservative. We had a liberal, so-called liberal with Obama. All of these issues that we're fighting about, we need to stop, take a deep breath, get away from the idea that we're the only generation that has dealt with them, and understand that these are the main fissures that plagued Western civilization through 2,500 years. I say plagued Western civilization. They were of no interest to anybody else. Everybody else either was ruled by a king, a tyrant, or a tribe. But only in the West was there constitutional government. And remember that all the other things that come out of this, a dynamic military, sophisticated technology, sophisticated urban planning, monumental architecture, unrivaled anywhere else, that was a product of constitutional government. The reason that there was not there was not a Sophocles in Peru, or there was not a Plato in Norway, was because they didn't have these constitutional systems. But within this constitutional system, the same fissures that we see today have already been discussed. All we have to do is read the great books and transcend our own lives a bit and try to take the argument up to a little bit more abstract plane. I think we'd be much better off. And I'll end with this sober thought. Plato was no fool. Aristotle was not stupid. Thucydides was brilliant. Herodotus was no dummy. The old oligarch, for all his right-wing views, was very, very sophisticated thinker. None of them supported radical democracy. And when we go into the later Western tradition, not only do most Western philosophers critique it until, as I said, the French Enlightenment, but there is another strain of bleak, pessimistic, nihilist thinkers. And these are people like Tacitus, Suetonius, Petronius, and especially later in Germany, Hegel, Nietzsche, that nut Oswald Spengler. And their critique was even more gloomy. And it was, if I could be fair to such a long line of philosophical thinkers in the great books, it went something like this. If you were to give people unlimited freedom under democracy, and if you were to allow them the capitalist system where they are free to make money, then that is a lethal combination, because it's going to encourage a constant satisfaction of the appetites and effort to satisfy the appetites. And when you have majority rule, people will always want to satisfy their appetites by voting themselves more and more entitlements and extending the idea of equality. Plato said the problem with Athens is once they give voting to slaves, once they give voting to women, they won't stop there. Because that's the logic of equality. We're going to go to the donkeys, and then to the dogs, and then all the animals who bark will get a vote in the assembly. He said that, not me. And so we end up with this pessimistic appraisal, albeit by a minority in later thought, that we are trying something very unusual. We're only into the third century of democracy, and we're running an $11 trillion debt, soon to be 20. And the more that I used to hate these thinkers, the more that I'm worried that they were onto something. That we in a democracy are not responsible enough to govern our own appetites, and will continue to find ways to expand freedom until it reaches what the Romans called license, and material appetites until it becomes what they called luxus, luxury or decadence. And that's something that we should ponder very, very, very carefully. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yes.
I've always enjoyed reading your opinions.
Thank you.
But is what you said tonight an argument in support of the Electoral College? I'm assuming that the Electoral College comes out of this idea of the mob rule.
Yes.
And is it possible that if we didn't have the Electoral College in 2001 or 2000, we wouldn't have this debt?
Let's remember who put the Electoral College in, and more importantly, the present system of Senate.
Can you hear the question?
Oh.
Can you repeat the question?
I'm sorry? Oh, can you repeat the question? The question was about the Electoral College, and do I support it, and did it have a role in regard to 2000 and our present debt? And I think the debt's been pretty much bipartisan. We kind of saw under Bush that if you're a right-winger, you can borrow money and print it. And we saw under Clinton that if you're a left-winger, you can bomb the hell out of somebody without ever going to the UN or to Congress, and nobody's going to say a word. That's kind of the way our system is. Nixon can go to China, and all of that. Obama can have targeted assassinations. Nobody, I don't even see Cindy Sheehan anymore around. But that's just because one party can do the opposite, and it always satisfies space. But on the question of the Electoral College, it's another item that the founders were very intent on, as well as Senate seats. Remember, the Senate seats were not apportioned by population. So we got two guys up in Montana and 2 in Wyoming, and they represent far fewer people than a borough in Los Angeles. And why is that? And we had an election in 2000, we had one prior as well, where the majority did not vote. And what the founders were trying to do is err on the side of republicanism rather than direct democracy. And they're trying to suggest to us there are going to be situations where popular votes have to be ratified by constitutional mechanisms and sober and judicious people. When I was a graduate student, I thought, boy, this is so unfair. Every time I heard a Democratic senator speak at UC Santa Cruz, and we had Alan Cranston, I remember him saying once, we should have senators apportioned by population. Why does Wyoming get to kind of veto what all of New York City wants? And, well, you can see why they do. We want people from a variety of backgrounds as checks on popular opinion. That was what the filibuster was all about. There's all of these mechanisms to check popular opinion. And that's why this strange founding idea that we're going to have vetoes, but we're going to have overrides, but we're going to have confirmation hearings on the Supreme Court, but they can declare the law unconstitutional, etc., because the founders did not trust popular opinion. They understood that there had to be the consent of the governed, or the system would not work. But they knew that the average person was capable of some very, very scary things. So they were going to make some institutional protections so that the modern-day Socrates was not executed, or the modern-day Middlenians were not executed, then reprieved, and then etc. So I think that's behind those quirky things that when you go to Europe, people just can't believe it in the parliamentary system. As far as the debt, I don't think it had much to do with the debt. The debt is right out of Aristophanes' Wasp. Aristophanes in the Wasp, as you know, says, hey, Dad, because you're lazy and you quit your job, there's a great job down there to be a paid juror. All you got to do is go find a bunch of people and say that they're anti-democratic and put them on trial and take their money so we don't have to work. Go to it. That's the play by a right-wing nut like Aristophanes. But the argument is that the debt is a mechanism, as I see it, to redistribute income from one generation to another, from one class to another, for the noble goal of equality of result. Whether it's Medicare, Social Security, excusing 50% of the population from paying any income tax. It's a methodology, and from both right and left use it to say that if we let people be free and give them personal liberty, we will not end up equal enough. There's too many Goldman Sachs guys, or there's too many guys that'll spend their hard-earned money on snowmobiles and they won't buy a Prius, or whatever it is. We need to restrict personal liberty and the accumulation of wealth in the Athenian fashion. Yes?
What do you predict the effect of the current status of our education system will be on the future of the
Well, the current question is what will be the effect of the current educational system?
on the future of democracy?
When I started teaching at California State University, the first thing I saw was a demonstration on campus by a group that said the CBEST test was unfair because too many people of a particular group failed it, and therefore to lower the standard. And I thought, how is that going to help people who need to be educated if the teachers are continually lowering the standards? 35% of the group that entered in 1984 was remedial. That meant 1 out of 3 of my students could not read or function in a literature class. Same was true of math. When I left in 2004 and retired, that number was 52%. But there was a funny thing happened. In 84, we had 5 centers for literacy. The Center for Literacy, the Center for Technological Innovation, the Center for Reentry, the Center for this, to help people. And when I left, we had 21 of them. And yet the remediation had almost doubled. So we are engaged in a great therapeutic experiment in education, in which we have created an entire bureaucratic class, administrative class, counseling class, teacher theory class, educational industry class, and we think that the old mechanism of literature and art and mathematics and biology did not work, and we're going to educate the masses with an end result they're going to be sensitive, they're going to be non-judgmental, they're going to be environmentally sophisticated, and they're going to be very confident about their abilities. But we don't think they really need to compute, to argue, to have a good vocabulary, to be able to appreciate art or music. And that's what we have today. We have the most arrogant and ignorant generation coming out of the universities we've ever had. And my only worry is that at what point will this start to affect us so that the plant down at Moss Landing starts to spark once in a while? And I've already seen the infrastructure of California start to fray. But at some point, the core group of people who are coming out of the high schools, if they are, we're having a 25% dropout rate, and coming out of the universities who are not educated are inheriting a sophisticated society created by a very educated class. So are they going to be able to keep that level of comfort and civilization? I'm very skeptical of it. I'm very, very skeptical. I think what's keeping us right now is we have about 10% of the population, which is 30 million people that are highly educated and more educated than anybody else in the world, and 30 million compared to the size of some countries is quite large. So that elite keeps the United States going. I don't know how long you continue to do that, because you can bump into the other 9 very quickly on the average day. Yeah.
Dr. Hanson, at the end of Carnage and Culture, you discussed the problem that some saw that a soft, weak American young would not be able to fill out the American military. Now, 9 years into the war, we see that the Ivy League graduates are not joining the military. The military is becoming more of a family business, and that the officer corps primarily is aligned one way politically. Yeah. I was wondering what you see the impacts for both the military and the society as a whole are.
That's a very, very good question, and I've written a long essay in this new book that came out this week about that. The good and bad news is that the military, all 1.6 million, is 19th century, if I could stereotype for such a large number. By that I mean they are far more patriotic, they are far more likely to be religious, they are far more nationalistic, they are far more traditional than the population at large. You're right to say they concentrate in families. I looked at some statistics. The officer corps tends to be largely from rural areas or south of the Mason-Dixon line. And the bad news is they are far more at odds with the typology of the American citizen, and the American governing class. So what we have now is we have a society that is in some ways antithetical to the military, and we have a governing class that doesn't know much about it, but they do know one thing that's damn good. It can go into the heart of the ancient caliphate and take out a thug in 3 weeks and then have an insurgent blow up on it and have everybody abandon it and then come up with another strategy and take off and still implant constitutional government within 4 years at the price of one battle at Saipan. I mean, they are very, very good at what they do. But the problem is that they don't represent the rest of us and we don't understand them very well. We just know that for some reason we kind of think privately to each other, I'm glad they're not like us, or we'd be helpless. But I'm glad I'm not like them because I don't want to live like that. I don't want to go to church, and I don't want to salute, and I don't want to salute the flag. I don't want to think that America's exceptional. Come on, that's not what I learned in college. Let somebody else go do that. And that's where we are. It's very schizophrenic. Yes?
Sir, you mentioned the relationship between democracy and innovation, particularly in Athens.
Yes.
And I wonder if you talk about that just in terms of what is about this way of governing that leads to innovative ways of thinking.
Yes. Well, the Athenian Pericles in the second book talks about that. He was an aristocrat, but what he's saying is that constitutional government in general includes a lot of people, but the more you include, the more people. So you're empowering people, and you're getting more dynamic reactions from that. Now, maybe they're not all equal, but if you pour enough money into it and you give people opportunities, you will discover talent where you don't find it. And so I guess if I could translate that into a modern parable, if I go to a really stuffy little campus like I do sometimes, like Dartmouth or I go speak at Brown. I mean, I know they have diversity and all that, but I go out to the free speech area at Cal State Fresno. It's a more dynamic place, remember that. Because I have a smaller cross-section of just aristocratic people and those places, but at Cal State Fresno, I got the hoi polloi out there. And it's dynamic, believe me. I've seen stuff at Fresno I'll never see anywhere else. And what he's trying to say is that that's good, up to a point, if you can control it. And that's what Europe says about the United States. Remember that I'm trying to be as fair-handed as I can, because the European critique, forget all about their socialism and their EU, they're still a class-bound society. When you go to Europe, I try to go 3 or 4 times a year, and every time I go over there and I do an interview, question 3 is, where did you go to school? Question 4 is, do you own any land? Question 5 was, who are your parents? Question 6, what college did your wife go to? Question 7, where are your children go to university? I don't hear that in America. Mostly it's, do you have any money? And that's what I like about America. A guy can come across the border from Mexico, and if he's a landscaper, and he corners the landscaping market in San Jose, and he's making $5 million. Believe me, San Jose State will want him on the board. Europe, he can never get on the board, and that's the dynamism of democracy. What we're struggling right now is we have that system, but we've got to slow it down a little bit. It's getting a little, it's getting a little wild, and that's always that age-old. To what degree do you empower the people before it becomes excessive without tradition? And so, we all love to go to Europe because it's quieter, people are more sober and judicious, they seem better educated, they're more conscious about things, and then you kind of snooze. And you come to the United States and it's wide open, I get on the 101 or the I-5 in LA, I've seen things that I can't even describe on that freeway. But I never quite see that in Europe. We have a couple more questions. I don't know what our time is. Yes, in the back.
To follow on the excellent military question, do you think the draft should or will be reinstated?
The question is the draft. As I understand it, there's pretty much a consensus that some type of national service in America's past, remember the draft has been quite rare in American history. World War I, World War II, and then during a large part of the Cold War. And the idea was it brings people of diverse backgrounds, especially economic backgrounds, and it gives them a shared experience. And more importantly, they write home, and it's a method of communication for the population at large to understand the military. So if everybody in this room had had military service, we all sort of know what a brigade is, we know what an M16 is, we can tell, we have that common experience, we understand our military. And that's I think everybody understands that. Where we get into problems is the mechanics of it in a society of 300 million people, because the cohort between 18 and 25 is about 30 million people. And the military does not want, in a postmodern, sophisticated, high-tech military, 30 million kids to deal with. So they want to self-select. They want to self-select by saying we want people with a high school diploma who are motivated, who want us. And now, as you know, they have more applicants than they can deal with. The other thing is that proponents of the draft, say from the left side, want an option for community service. Well, we've seen that in Europe. There's only 3 countries in Europe that still have a draft, and they're getting rid of it. Because what happens with community service, that people self-select. Aristocratic, wealthier, upper middle class, better educated kids all go the social service route. And they all want to engage in social engineering jobs, community organizing, etc. And then the lower middle classes take the military route. And it doesn't solve the problem of getting this all together. So if you're going to have a draft, you're going to have to get all 30 million kids together, and you're going to have to convince the military that we need, a 5 or 6 million man combat force. And they were going to say to us, as they've told me a number of times, if I have my druthers, I'd rather take a Raptor at 160 million than have about 300,000 suburban kids to deal with in my, extra each year. So they've made that decision. Most of them don't want a draft, and that's where we are. I don't see it happening, even though that the civic goals are noble, and we need some kind of unifying experience. Yes?
Dr. Hanson, you know, on Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? If I got you on that show, do you think you could pass that test, or do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't know what you're talking about.
I want to say this. There's people there that are on that show, and Foxworthy is, I believe that's his name, Jeff Foxworthy is the fellow that runs it. And he's got some really bright people with degrees up that long, and they're not very smart. So I just wondered how you'd do if I got you on the show.
I think it depends on what you asked me.
It's fifth grade and down, I think.
Yeah. You know what saved me was if I am saved, rest like me. Until I was 18, I was on a farm, and then I had this hiatus of 4 years undergraduate and 5 years in Greece. I lived almost 3 years in Greece and at Stanford, and I came home, and I wanted to get a job teaching. There were none, so for 5 years I farmed, and then for another 10 to 15 I farmed and taught. And I learned something quite unusual, and that is the ability to take apart a transmission on a Massey Ferguson 265 was a little bit more difficult than mastering the optative mood in Greek. And I noticed that to use an echo chainsaw and do it properly and change the chain and get the motor working continually when you needed it was harder than remembering how many tributary states actually paid tribute to the Athenian Empire. My point is that I had been taught as an undergraduate and a graduate that the most brilliant people got PhDs. And yet, I still see this argument when everybody gets mad at Wall Street. And we, especially as a teacher, and all you teachers in the audience are prone to that, are susceptible to that argument, that we are teachers, and therefore we must be brilliant people. And these nutty guys at Goldman Sachs, and these nutty trial lawyers, and these nutty surgeons who make so much more than us. But my experience is they're really smart people. And that the PhDs that I knew and that I worked with, I hate to say it, at Cal State are not. So I have a prejudice, and I'm trying to deal with it because I have 20 years of empirical. I think I've taught now at 6 different universities, and I've spent a great deal of my time with PhDs, and I'm just convinced that it's a negative selective process.
Dr. Hanson, I want to tell you that your mother and father were really wonderful people in Fresno County.
Thank you.
And I remember them.
They were strong Democrats, and
yeah, that was the only thing wrong.
We have one more question. Yes, I would. One more question, and right here, and then I'll be happy if anybody sign some books.
Dr. Hanson, the other day I walked out of Whole Foods and I was accosted by this man with a clipboard with initiatives. And when I said I didn't like this one, he flipped to the other one, and when I said I didn't like that one, he flipped to the other one. I thought you might want to comment on the initiatives.
Well, this is a good state to comment on it, isn't it? Because that is the perfect example of what Thucydides and Plato were worried about with direct democracy. They said, you know what, people are impulsive. It's like voting to kill the people at Minnelini. So the 3 Strikes initiative started in Fresno. I thought it was a great idea, and I went on a radio show, and I just very tamely, timidly suggest that we're going to have to build a lot of prison. And I'm for that, just so you guys will understand that. And I couldn't walk in Fresno for the next week. The same thing with teachers. X amount of money must be on education. I just timidly said, I have gone to the high schools. I was in a school where 60% of the kids could not speak English growing up, and when the classes were 40 to 50 students, I'm not convinced that putting everybody down to 20 or 12 or whatever, then paying these teachers is going to make any difference unless you go back to a traditional curriculum. But the people had their way. And so that is a danger. And we all go back and forth. That when we have 51%, the people want it, and it's reasonable, I'm for it. And of course, I don't like judges overturning it. But nevertheless, in California, a lot of our problems, not all of them, it's exaggerated, but it's the initiative process that has locked up so much of the budget that we have no ability either to cut things or to raise revenues. And I'll just end with this sober thought. California is a canary of the mine in the way that Greece is a canary of the EU mine. They're very similar. It's called sunshine socialism. And they work on a very easy principle. Greece is such a beautiful country. There's always going to be people visit there and spend money, so then they don't have to change. California is such a beautiful country. There's always going to be people coming in that allow us to continue what we're doing up to a point. But right now we have the highest income tax rates, we have the highest sales tax rates, we have the highest gasoline rates, and we have the largest deficit. And yet our schools are 47th and 48th in math and science. So, and our infrastructure is not competitive. And so something is wrong fundamentally with this idea of California as we know it. It's not the California we had 40 years ago. So we have to, and the answer I think is philosophical. We were utopian in the way that the great books warned us. We wanted to live the world as it should be rather than as it could be. And we thought there were always going to be somebody else who would give us money so that we could be very fair and feel good. And that somebody is leaving the state at $3,500 a week. Thank you very much.